is up? And welcome back to Beyond the Arc with Brandon Silvers. As always, I am your host, Brandon Silvers, talking Paralympics today. But first, hate my voice, but love my takes. Good news for you, I write as well. Check out my blog in the show notes. My first weekly sports watch guide went out on Thursday. It was awesome. Again, you need to check it out. All right, let's get into it. Okay, so my weekly sports watch guide actually evolved from the daily watch guide that I did during the Olympics. I did that because I love the Olympics, always have. I imagine I always will. The flip side of that is when the Olympics end, I always get that Olympic hangover where I'm sad that it's over, so I'm kind of blah as I return to the regular sports world. Well, if you're like me in that sense, then I have fantastic news. Lucky for us, the Paralympics are going on right now as we speak. The Paralympic Games are taking place at the exact same venues, and for the first time in my memory, we can watch them relatively easily thanks to NBC and Peacock. This is actually the first time that NBC is sending their hosts to be there on site for the Paralympics. So let's take advantage of that, see if we can delay that Olympic hangover a little bit longer. If you are new to the Paralympics, no worries. We are learning together today. Let's go over a little bit of the history, how the games operate. Then I'm going to go rapid fire through some of the incredible athlete stories I found while getting ready for this episode. All right, we know the Paralympics are for athletes with physical impairments. However, all impairments are not created equal, so there are competitors with all kinds of physical impairments competing. From athletes who are missing limbs, to those who are visually impaired, to the wheelchair-bound, to those with conditions such as cerebral palsy that affect their ability to move. With so many different factors at play, they have to make the competitions fair. How do they do that? Well, each of the 22 Paralympic sports has a classification board. That board certifies whether an athlete's impairment allows them to be eligible to compete and then separates them into divisions based on their level of impairment. For example, within track and field, or para-track and field as it's called here, there are participants with a wide range of impairments who compete, but they only compete against other athletes within their classification. Now, there is a mixed medley relay where we see athletes across classifications compete, but for individual events, if you are wheelchair-bound, you will compete against other wheelchair-bound athletes. As I said, this goes even deeper, and I don't want to get too much into it. Just know that they are trying to make this as fair as possible across all sports and all events. This is important because where sports are being played, people cheat to get an edge. Shout out to my Astros fans. And athletes have been caught exaggerating or even faking impairments. And yes, there have been dopers as well. The biggest scandal to date involving this is probably back at the 2000 games when the Spanish national team cheated to win gold in the now defunct basketball for intellectual disabilities event. They had a player by the name of Carlos Ribagorda on the team. Now, Carlos was a basketball player, but he was not intellectually disabled. He was also an undercover journalist who set out to expose this very scam. Only 2 of the team's 12 players met the criteria to compete in the event, according to Carlos. The Spanish Paralympic Committee didn't have the athletes undergo the necessary testing that would have exposed them. He also claimed that this was happening in other sports. Now, obviously, that's not what any sporting event, much less the Paralympics, is supposed to be. And while there is cheating, because that's what you have when athletes get to competing, the International Paralympic Committee works even harder than the IOC to make sure events are as clean as can be. The first ever Paralympic Games took place in 1960 in Italy, but the seed for it was planted right after World War II, and competition was a secondary aspect. In 1944, there were all these people who had been injured during the war. As you can imagine, this was tough to deal with. The British government was like, look, we've got all these people whose lives are changed, but they still want to participate in athletics. This could also help with the rehabilitation process for them. Let's see what we can do. They put a Dr. Ludwig Gutmann, which is a perfect British doctor name, in charge of figuring this out. And in 1948, he organized an archery competition for wheelchair-bound athletes. He had 16 competitors in what was called the Stoke Mandeville Games, named after the Stoke Mandeville Hospital, where he treated spinal injury patients. These games evolved into the Paralympics, and by those first Paralympic Games in 1960, the number of participants went from those initial 16 competitors to 23 countries being represented by 400 athletes. This year, more than 4,000 athletes will compete. Now, that's 4,000 athletes with their own unique and incredible story. While I want to tell all of these stories, particularly on someone's payroll in 2028, I'm willing to admit that 4,000 stories might be a bit out of my capacity at the moment. Instead, I'm going to try to pick out the most incredible stories, particularly from Team USA athletes, and share them here so you know them, because I found my information all over the place. While we do that, I'll try to touch on some of the interesting aspects of the sports as well. Y'all know I'm a track and field fanatic, so let's start with para track and field. Brittany Mason is one of our star sprinters, and what's wild is that almost wasn't the case because she didn't even know she was eligible to compete. Brittany has a condition called Erb's palsy that limits the range of motion in one of her arms. Your arms play a crucial role in how fast you can sprint by helping generate forward momentum and keeping your body centered, all kind of stuff. Go out there and try to sprint without using your arms, and you'll see what I'm talking about. In spite of this, Brittany ran college track for Eastern Michigan. She thought that was that and was ready to move on to the next phase of her life, but someone reached out to her coach there to see if his athlete would be interested in competing in para track and field. Brittany says her coach didn't realize who they were talking about for like a year, but finally figured it out and told her. And when she first talked to him, she was like, "What are y'all talking about? I'm not disabled." They were like, okay, fair enough, but we do have a classification for athletes with Erb's palsy, and she pursued this opportunity, and look at her now. She won Paralympic gold in Tokyo in the 4x1 mixed relay. This time around, she'll be competing in the T47 classification 100 meters, where she was the world champion in 2019, and the T47 200 meters, where she was the world champion in 2023. She has a personal best of 11.89 seconds in the 100 and 25 flat in the 200. Nick Mayhew will also be competing for Team USA in para track and field. He's the defending gold medalist in the T37 100 and 200. He'll be competing in the 100 and the long jump this time around in the T38 classification. He's got cerebral palsy, but he wasn't diagnosed until he was 14. He'd struggled with some numbness and other symptoms his whole life up to that point, but it wasn't until he underwent all kinds of tests and scans after suffering a grand mal seizure that doctors figured out what was going on. Turns out that Nick had suffered a stroke while he was in his mom's womb that left him with a hole in the right side of his brain that affected the left side of his body. Despite his symptoms prior to his seizure, Nick had been an avid soccer player, but after the diagnosis, doctors told him he wouldn't be able to play again. Nick is built different, parentheses complimentary, because he was back on the field in 6 months. He played collegiately at Radford, where they made 2 NCAA tournament appearances. He then played for U.S. Soccer's Paralympic national team, where he was named Player of the Year in 2019. That very same year, he was recruited to compete for Team USA's para track and field team. His biggest competition in the 100 is his Team USA teammate, Jaden Blackwell, who holds the world record with a time of 10.72. Jaden also competed in track collegiately at Division II Purdue Northwest. He weighed 1 pound 9 ounces when he was born. He's also competing in the 400, where he holds the fastest PR with a time of 48.49. Tatiana McFadden will be competing in the T54 classification in the women's 100, 400, 800, and marathon. She's already won 7 individual Paralympic gold medals, including 4 at the 2016 Games in Rio. Her story was the first I came across that made me want to start researching all of these athletes. She was born in the Soviet Union when it was still the Soviet Union. She has been paralyzed from the waist down since birth due to a condition called spina bifida. This was too much for her birth mother to handle, so she ended up at an orphanage. They couldn't afford a wheelchair for her, so she walked on her hands for the first 6 years of her life. Yes, you heard that correctly. Also, doctors told her that she was going to die. Well, she certainly didn't die, and also she met a woman who was traveling through Russia as a commissioner of disabilities for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, who adopted her and brought her to the United States, and here she is. Then there's Hunter Woodhall, who will be competing in the men's 100 in T64 and men's 400 in T62. He's won 3 Paralympic medals already. We just saw his wife, Tara Davis Woodhall, win Olympic gold in the long jump just a couple of weeks ago. Hunter, who had both of his legs amputated before he turned 1, became the first double amputee to earn a Division I track and field scholarship when he signed with the University of Arkansas. His season best of 46.09 in the 400 makes him the favorite in that event this year. There are also para-track events for the visually impaired. In some classifications, runners are allowed to take the track on their own, but in others, they have a guide who runs alongside them. Both the athlete and the guide receive medals. The coordination involved is something I cannot even begin to comprehend. First of all, runners are blindfolded since vision isn't as simple as seeing versus not being able to see. In an effort to take that variable out, the runners are made to block out any and all vision. The guide helps them set up in the blocks if necessary. Then they each hold the end of this tether thing and off they go. In addition to the typical training that you would do to sprint, they also have to work on coordinating their movements with their guide. I cannot even imagine running like this. I can barely get to the bathroom without my contacts in. So check out the T11 track events if you want to watch this one. Also, para track and field has other events like the long jump, high jump, javelin, shot put, and discus with participants from a whole host of classifications. Now, moving away from the track, there's also a sport called blind football for the visually impaired. It's soccer, or really soccer's miniature cousin, futsal. Again, to account for the wide range of visual impairments, athletes have their eyes taped shut and covered with a blindfold. There are 4 players and 1 goalie per side. The goalie can have sight and doesn't have to wear a blindfold. The ball has a bell in it to let the players know where it is. And as you can imagine, communication is super important. In addition to communicating with each other and the goalie giving instructions, they also have a sighted guide at midfield and another in the attacking area. Because of this, spectators must remain silent during the 40-minute match, which makes a hell of a lot more sense than during golf or tennis. Goalball is another Paralympic sport for the visually impaired. Again, blindfolds all around, including the goalie this time. It kind of resembles handball in that players are trying to throw a ball into a goal. The ball must roll or bounce, so best I can figure defenders and the goalie remain as close to the ground as possible. Players trying to score do stand up though. 3 players are on the court for each team. Again, the ball has a bell and spectators are silent. Like the Paralympics themselves, this was initially developed as a rehab sport for World War II vets, but it didn't become a medal event in the Paralympics until 1976. 2 12-minute halves, so it goes quick. Now, to a sport I know a little bit more about, wheelchair basketball. I like to remind y'all that not only did I hoop, but I also tore my Achilles once. As a result, I was in a wheelchair for a short enough time to realize I would be awful at wheelchair basketball. As a basketball fanatic, I made my girlfriend take me to the gym so I could shoot while I was in my wheelchair. It was exhausting, and she was rebounding for me, and the hoop was lowered to like 8 feet. That's not how the game is played here. It's played on a regulation hoop. So I'm definitely out on this one as a player, but we can and should watch. So what are the rules? Regulation court and scoring. There's also traveling. You can't take more than 2 pushes without dribbling. Also, if you look at the rosters, each player has a different classification number based on their level of impairment, 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, 4 point, and 4.5 points. When you add the classification points of the players on the court up, that number can't exceed 14 points. Can you imagine? Steve Kerr and Cheryl Reeve had enough trouble with their rotations. The U.S. men are going for their 3rd straight Paralympic gold. The women won bronze in Tokyo after winning gold in 2016. Colleges have wheelchair basketball teams, and EuroLeague has pro wheelchair basketball. If there's anything else, any other leagues, someone let me know. The women's sitting volleyball team is also going for their 3rd straight gold medal. They have not missed the podium since it became a medal event in 2004. On the men's side, Iran has dominated. It became a Paralympic sport in 1976. Of those 12 Paralympic Games, Iran has won gold medals in 7 of them. I really only brought them up so I can talk about their former player from the 2016 and 2021 gold medal winning squads, Morteza Merzad, who plays sitting volleyball due to leg issues caused by gigantism. When he stands, he is 8'1". Now, sitting volleyball is pretty self-explanatory. It's volleyball, except the net is lower and one butt cheek must remain in contact with the ground at all times because that's what sitting is. Para swimming seems to have similar classifications to the ones found in para track and field. Jessica Long is one of the most dominant Paralympians ever. She came from the same North Baltimore Aquatic Club as Michael Phelps and made her first Paralympics team at 12 years old and won 3 gold medals. She's now won 29 Paralympic medals total, including 16 gold. You can catch her in the S8 classification, trying to add to that total in the 400 freestyle, 100 backstroke, 100 butterfly, and the 200 individual medley. Quick little history lesson. The greatest Paralympian ever is former U.S. swimmer Trisha Zorn, who won 55 medals. 41 of those were gold. She was also the first visually impaired athlete to earn a Division I scholarship and was a 4-time All-American swimmer in the backstroke at Nebraska. Finally, let's finish up with wheelchair rugby. If you read the tidbit I wrote about this in screenshots, you know this was originally called Murderball. This was invented to give athletes who were too physically impaired to play wheelchair basketball a sport to play. It's played on an indoor court and has the same classification rules as basketball, where the total classification points for the players on the court can't exceed a certain amount. There was a documentary about the sport called Murderball that came out in 2005 that I probably need to go watch now. Roger Ebert compared it favorably to Hoop Dreams. A lot of people know the sport from Friday Night Lights, the TV show, where Jason Street started playing after being paralyzed. A neat thing about wheelchair rugby is it's actually mixed gender. In the morning I was planning this episode out, American Sarah Adam became the first female to score a wheelchair rugby goal in the Paralympics. Her journey into wheelchair rugby actually started as an able-bodied volunteer. She was pursuing a career in occupational therapy to help people with their own disabilities live normal lives when she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Her first symptoms were actually noticed by a professor of hers when they were learning about tests for hand functions, and they were testing it out in class, obviously, and the professor noticed that hers was a little bit off. She was already in this career path and started volunteering and playing wheelchair rugby recreationally, and she credits the sport for helping her accept her body's limitations as it became more and more clear that she would eventually need to use a wheelchair full time. She tried out for the national team in December of 2021, and now she's making Paralympic history. As this episode comes to an end, I've only covered a fraction of a percent of the stories surrounding the Paralympics. There's a subconscious thing I feel like we as a society do, where we treat these athletes as less than. I mean, I was just praising NBC for their coverage when, as much as it has improved and is headed in the right direction, it doesn't come close to Olympic coverage. But these are athletes, competitors, and the stuff they do is just as impressive, if not more, than their Olympic counterparts. I just saw a clip of this Egyptian table tennis player, Ibrahim Hamedo, who has no arms. He serves the ball with his foot and he holds the paddle in his mouth and would demolish all of us watching and listening. Noah Lyles can't do that. He's too busy putting his foot in his mouth. So if you can't tell, that's where I'm headed with my sports coverage. I'm still covering the NBA, NFL, college football, MLB, all of these so-called quote unquote major sports. But what the Olympics taught me is that there's so much more out there that we can pay attention to, whether that's the Paralympics or college volleyball or whatever. So I'm going to try to cover as much as possible, as long as I feel like I'm doing it in a way that's informative, entertaining, and most importantly, authentic to me. Appreciate you all rocking with me, whether that's watching, listening, rating, subscribing, reviewing, and sharing. This has been another episode of Beyond the Arc with Brandon Silvers. The Gamecocks football captain's log with Captain Petey is back. Beyond the Bark with my dog Kobe making NFL picks is back this week as well. Screenshots, my weekly sports watch guide, drops every Thursday morning. Have a fantastic week, and I will catch you later.